How's it going, everyone? Landon with Late Model Restoration. Our AOD to T5 transmission swap series has now made it to part 4. This segment covers T5 prep, which involves a bearing retainer upgrade, rear main seal replacement, a pilot bearing installation, along with spacer plate, flywheel, clutch disc, and a pressure plate assembly placement. We're almost to the finish line, so let's check it out. Like any detailed swap series, I encourage you to watch parts 1, 2, and 3 to get a better understanding about the swap and to see what we've already accomplished. To this point, I have removed the majority of the interior, swapped out the pedal assemblies, the automatic assembly for the manual assembly, and have removed the atrocious AOD transmission from the car. Part 4 will involve all the prep work to get the T5 ready for installation. I use several new parts during these steps, some of which are required, and I also encourage you to do the same if you're picking up a used T5 setup. These particular components include a new rear main seal, pilot bearing, spacer plate, flywheel bolts, a pressure plate and dowel pin kit, a bell housing bolt kit, transmission to bell housing bolts, a pivot stud, clutch fork, and throwout bearing. If you do go the used T5 route, be sure and inspect the input bearing retainer. If it still has the factory aluminum retainer, get rid of that thing and upgrade to one of our steel bearing retainers. The T5 I'm going to be using in this video had input bearing failure where the sleeve actually separated from the base. So I'm going to cover removal and the installation procedures of an input bearing retainer, which is covered in this segment. With the AOD transmission now out of the way, this is the perfect time to service the rear main seal. To do this, carefully use a small flathead to pry out the old seal. Be sure and make a mental note of the seal's orientation. Go ahead and clean the area with brake clean and inspect for any damage or for materials that could be present. Once inspection is complete, apply a thin film of fresh oil to the outside of the rear main seal. Position the seal into place with the back of the seal facing towards you. This will be the side that doesn't have the inner lip. Lightly tap the seal into position until it is flush with the back of the engine block. Now it's time to install the pilot bearing. Since the front face of the converter sits inside of the crankshaft, a pilot bearing is not needed for an automatic transmission setup. Take your new pilot bearing and position it into the crankshaft. Using an appropriate width deep impact socket and dead blow, lightly tap the pilot bearing into place. For this car, I am utilizing a T5 transmission from a donor car, which still has some good components. I cleaned and scuffed the flywheel's mating surface prior to install. This was done with a little bit of WD-40, a Scotch-Brite pad, and then was rinsed clean with quality brake clean. Utilizing new pressure plate retaining hardware, apply a liberal amount of thread locker to the threads. Go ahead and position the spacer plate intended for a manual transmission over the dowels in the engine block. Then align the flywheel bolt holes with the crankshaft. If they don't line up, keep rotating the flywheel until they are all aligned with one another. Thread the retaining bolts into the crankshaft and loosely tighten. For some extra leverage when torquing the flywheel retaining hardware, go ahead and screw in a few of the pressure plate bolts into the flywheel. Position a pry bar in between the bolts and then torque the flywheel retaining hardware to 75 to 85 foot-pounds, working in a cross pattern. Once the flywheel bolts are torqued, go ahead and remove the pressure plate bolts. Wipe the flywheel mating surface again with some quality brake clean and make sure the pilot bearing has enough grease. Since the flywheel I am using already had the pressure plate locating dowels installed, this was not shown. To do this, simply tap the locating dowels into the correct location on the flywheel. Then slide the alignment tool through the clutch disc and then position it into place. Make sure the raised part of the disc is facing away from the flywheel. Wipe the pressure plate to clutch disc mating surface with quality brake clean and apply some thread locker to the new pressure plate retaining hardware. Position the pressure plate assembly over the dowel pins and the flywheel. Loosely thread in the retaining hardware. Make sure the alignment tool is still centered and then torque the pressure plate retaining hardware to 12 to 24 foot-pounds, again, working in a cross pattern. Now you can remove the alignment tool. Apply some grease to the pivot stud pocket on the clutch fork, along with a thin film in the areas where the throwout bearing is going to make contact. Even though I am using a few donor parts, I did utilize a new clutch fork, pivot stud, and throwout bearing. Be sure and apply grease to the pivot stud head along with a thin film of grease to the inside and face of the throwout bearing. Slide the throwout bearing into the clutch fork, making sure the lip of the bearing is over the tension spring and not underneath. Now you can go ahead and position the clutch fork into the bell housing and engage the fork into the pivot stud. Utilizing new hardware, install the bell housing and loosely tighten the hardware. Then torque those 6 bolts to 39 to 54 foot-pounds working in a cross pattern. Reposition the starter and retighten the retaining bolts. Now I'm going to go ahead and address the bearing retainer. These steps are for anyone that is getting a T5 second hand and needs to replace the bearing retainer. Place a 2x4 underneath the base of the transmission so that it remains level. Loosen and remove the 4 bearing retainer to transmission bolts. It is normal for a little fluid to run out when removing the old retainer. Taking a closer look at this retainer, the sleeve had separated itself from the base. Use a small drift and hammer to separate the bearing retainer from the transmission. Carefully scrape away any traces of old gasket maker. Be sure and cover the area so that no debris enters the transmission. Once all the gasket maker is removed, thoroughly wipe down the area with quality brake clean. Be sure and transfer the old shim and bearing race from the old retainer. You may have to very lightly tap the race into the new retainer with a rubber mallet. Take this time to thoroughly clean the 4 retaining bolts. Before continuing, make sure the tension ring inside of the retainer seal is not on the input shaft. The new retainer will have one pre-installed into the seal. Apply a thin film of fluid around the opening in the transmission. Go ahead and clean the back side of the new retainer with quality brake clean. Apply a decent amount of gasket maker to the retainer. Then position the new retainer over the input shaft. Lightly tap the retainer into place. Go ahead and reinstall the previously removed bolts and torque to 15 pound-feet. Once that is complete, now would be a perfect time to drain and replace the fluid, again if you picked up a used transmission. If you have a new T5, simply open the fill plug and fill it with roughly 2.5 quarts of transmission fluid or until fluid starts to seep from the opening. To view our transmission fluid change video, go ahead and click the link in the description or the card in the upper right hand corner on your screen. That will conclude part 4 of our AOD to T5 swap series. I covered a lot of stuff, but pretty much all of it is very straightforward. I did fail to mention one thing. When choosing a flywheel for your swap, and if you're still running a stock bottom end 302, you'll need a 50 ounce imbalanced flywheel. If you have custom engine work, be sure and consult the engine builder for the proper balance. For more information on the swap, click the link in the description. Next up is part 5, and we will cross the finish line on the swap. To stay up to date with this swap, go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already done so. Until next time, guys, keep it right here with the real Fox Body Mustang enthusiasts, LMR.com.